1944, the Eastern Front was a frozen graveyard of iron. Somewhere in the mud, a Tiger tank commander sat inside the most powerful weapon ever built, yet he was completely helpless. His engine had seized, his fuel was gone, and he watched a tide of average Allied tanks roll past him toward Berlin. This was the ultimate paradox of World War II. The side with the best technology was the side that ran out of time. And this is where the myth begins to fall apart, because the very engineering we've spent decades admiring was quietly working against Germany from the very start. Tonight, we're peeling back the armor plating on the Tiger legend to uncover the precision paradox, the hidden flaw that turned Hitler's finest steel into a 60-ton trap. Because the real reason the Tiger failed isn't found in its gun, it's found in logistics. And once you see it, you'll never look at the Tiger the same way again. Think back to the first time you heard the name Tiger. For many of us who grew up in the shadow of the greatest generation, that word didn't evoke an animal. It evoked a 56-ton nightmare of steel and smoke. It was the bogeyman of the battlefield, a machine so dominant that it forced the Allies to coin a specific term, tigerphobia. We were told that the Tiger was the pinnacle of German genius, an apex predator that could pick off Shermans from a mile away before our boys even knew they were in a fight. It's a powerful image, isn't it? The idea of a technological marvel that was simply too good to lose. But there is a sharp, painful difference between a weapon that wins a battle and a weapon that wins a war. While the Tiger was busy building its legend on the Eastern Front and in the sands of North Africa, it was simultaneously digging a grave for the very Third Reich it was meant to save. We look at the Tiger today as a symbol of strength, but history suggests it was actually the ultimate engineering dead end, a masterpiece of over-design that prioritized tactical ego over strategic reality. To understand how this trap was set, we have to look at what the German High Command actually wanted. By 1941, they weren't looking for a balanced tank, they were looking for a silver bullet. Therefore, when the Henschel and Porsche firms began their competing designs, they weren't thinking about how a mechanic would fix a transmission in a muddy ditch in Russia. They were building a land battleship. When you look past the legend and examine the cold, hard facts, the sheer absurdity of the Tiger's specifications becomes clear. The Germans insisted on mounting the 8.8-centimeter Flak 36, the legendary 88, as the primary armament. It was arguably the best gun of the war, capable of punching through 100 millimeters of armor at a full 1,000 yards. But to carry that gun and the 100 millimeters of vertical face-hardened steel plate required to protect it, the tank's weight ballooned to nearly 60 tons. For context, the American M4 Sherman weighed about 33 tons. Now, imagine the strain that puts on every single bolt and gear. This is where the invincibility illusion begins to shatter. Because the tank was so heavy, it couldn't cross most European bridges. It required a specialized, ultra-expensive trailer just to move it to the front lines without burning out the engine. And that engine? The Maybach HL230. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, but it was being asked to move a mountain. It had a lifespan measured in hours, not weeks. But the real trap wasn't just the weight, it was the philosophy behind the build. In the US, we built the Sherman like we built our cars, interchangeable parts, mass production, and ease of repair. The Germans, however, treated each Tiger like a handcrafted Swiss watch. The facts tell a sobering story of wasted potential. Each Tiger I required roughly 300,000 man-hours to produce. In the time it took Germany to hand-forge one Tiger, the United States was rolling dozens of Shermans off the assembly line. We often hear the veteran's tale that it took 5 Shermans to kill one Tiger, and while that might have been true in a head-to-head skirmish, the strategic math was even brutal. The Allies always had the 6th, 7th, and 8th tank waiting. The Germans only had the 1, and it was usually stuck in the mud waiting for a spare part that was 500 miles away. This leads us to the heart of the engineering dead end, the interleaved road wheel system, known as the Schachtelaufwerk. On paper, it was brilliant. It distributed the Tiger's massive weight so well that it actually had lower ground pressure than many lighter tanks, allowing it to glide over soft earth. But as anyone who has ever turned a wrench knows, brilliant on paper is often a disaster in the field. If you've ever worked on heavy equipment in the winter, you'll recognize the fatal flaw here, the frozen mud disaster. Because of that overlapping wheel design, there was nowhere for debris to go. Mud and snow would get trapped in the gaps, and once the sun went down in Russia, that mixture froze solid. Come morning, their invincible tank was anchored to the earth by nothing more than ice. Come morning, the invincible Tiger was nothing more than a 60-ton pillbox, unable to move, waiting to be picked off by Soviet infantry. Therefore, the Tiger was never a sustainable weapon of war. It was a psychological tool that terrified the Allies but bankrupted the German soul. It was a tank designed for a parade ground, forced to fight in a meat grinder. As we move forward, we have to ask ourselves, how did a nation of world-class engineers convince themselves that a tank that couldn't cross a bridge or survive a winter was the key to victory? The answer lies in the ghost of the T-34 and the panic that set in when the Germans realized their superior blitzkrieg had finally hit a wall it couldn't climb. To understand the Tiger, we must first understand the shock that shattered the German ego in the summer of 1941. Before this, the Wehrmacht believed they were the undisputed masters of the armored world. They had sliced through Poland and France with light, nimble panzers that favored speed over sheer power. But when they crossed into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, they ran headfirst into a ghost that would haunt their engineers until the fall of Berlin. Many of us remember the narrative of the Cold War, the looming threat of the Soviet bear. But in 1941, the German soldier looked at the Russian Untermensch with nothing but disdain. That disdain evaporated the moment a sleek, sloped armor machine called the T-34 appeared on the horizon. It wasn't just a tank, it was a revelation. It made every German gun obsolete overnight. History suggests that the Tiger wasn't born out of a calm, methodical design process. It was a frantic, terrified response to a weapon the Germans never saw coming. Imagine the sudden, chilling tank terror that gripped the front lines in 1941. The German crews who thought they were invincible suddenly faced the T-34 and the KV-1. They watched in disbelief as their 37mm anti-tank guns, the very weapons meant to protect them, became little more than door knockers, with shells skipping off Soviet steel like stones across a pond. German tankers watched in horror as Soviet shells tore through their panzers, while their own return fire did nothing. This wasn't just a tactical setback, it was an existential crisis. The German High Command realized that if they didn't produce a heavy hitter immediately, the Red Army would simply drive over them. But panic is a poor architect. Therefore, instead of taking the time to refine a balanced design, Hitler and his industrial titans pivoted towards overwhelming force. They abandoned the mobility that had won them France and obsessed over two things: the biggest gun and the thickest armor possible. This was the panic response. They didn't want a better tank, they wanted a monster that would restore the psychological dominance they had lost on the steppes of Russia. You have to imagine the atmosphere in the engineering offices of Henschel and Porsche. The pressure was immense. Hitler was personally involved, demanding that the new tank be ready for his 53rd birthday. This led to a purple value fact that is often overlooked. The Tiger was essentially an upscaled version of an older, rejected heavy tank project, the VK-36.01, stretched and strained to fit the massive 88mm gun. Because they were in such a rush to counter the T-34, they skipped the crucial testing and iteration phase that every successful machine needs. They took a 30-ton concept and forced it to become a 56-ton reality. But here is the critical but. While the T-34 used sloped armor to deflect shells, a genius move that saved weight, the Germans stuck to their traditional vertical box design. Why? Because sloping the thick armor they wanted would have made the tank even wider, meaning it wouldn't fit on German rail cars. So, to achieve the protection they needed to survive the T-34's 76mm gun, they had to make the steel plates incredibly thick, up to 100mm on the front. This was brute force engineering. It worked in a vacuum, but it created a chain reaction of mechanical failures. Every extra inch of steel added tons of weight, which in turn demanded a more powerful engine, which produced more heat, which melted the seals in the transmission. The historical records reveal a sobering reality about those first Tigers sent to the Leningrad front in 1942. It was an absolute disaster. Out of the very first 4 Tigers ever deployed into combat, every single one of them either suffered a mechanical breakdown or became hopelessly bogged down in the swampy Russian terrain. One was even captured by the Soviets because the Germans couldn't tow it away in time. It was a humiliating debut for Hitler's invincible weapon. But the ghost of the T-34 had done its work. It had scared the Germans into building a tank that was too heavy for its own feet. They were so focused on the payoff, a tank that could destroy any Soviet vehicle from 2,000 yards, they ignored the setup. And the setup for any war of attrition is reliability. Think about the men who had to operate these machines. Imagine being a tank commander, knowing you have the most powerful gun in the world, but also knowing that if you turn your turret too fast on an incline, the motor might burn out and leave you defenseless. The Tiger offered the illusion of security. It told the crew they were safe from shells, but it never told them they were safe from the machine itself. In many ways, the T-34 was the working man's tank, rough, loud, and built by the thousands in factories that prioritized good enough over perfect. The Tiger, by contrast, was an aristocrat. It was refined, expensive, and fragile. The Germans had fallen into a trap of their own making. They believed that a few perfect weapons could defeat an endless tide of good enough ones. Therefore, the Tiger became a symbol of German desperation. Every time a T-34 rolled off the line in the Urals, it added another pound of pressure to the German psyche. The Tiger was their attempt to claw back that feeling of superiority, but in doing so, they committed to an engineering path that had no future. They were building a dinosaur in an age that required a wolf. As we look closer at this engineering dead end, we see that the problem wasn't just the design, it was the way the Germans built them. They weren't using assembly lines, they were using craftsmen. And in a world of industrial warfare, craftsmanship is a luxury that costs you the war. In the world of manufacturing, there is a fine line between high quality and over-engineered. For those of us who appreciate the weight of a well-made tool or the smooth action of a vintage firearm, the German approach to engineering feels inherently right. We've been told for decades that German engineering is the gold standard. But in the life-or-death struggle of the 1940s, that very obsession with perfection became a precision paradox. History suggests that the Germans didn't lose the tank war because their engineering was bad. They lost because it was too good for the messy reality of a global conflict. If you walk into a modern machine shop today, you see automation and standardized parts. But to understand the Tiger, you have to imagine a workshop that felt more like a master watchmaker's studio. The Germans didn't just want a tank that worked, they wanted a masterpiece. While the United States was embracing the brutal efficiency of Detroit's assembly lines, Germany was still relying on the Meister system, highly skilled craftsmen who hand-fitted components with agonizing precision. It's a nostalgic thought, the idea of a machine built with soul. But on a battlefield where tanks were being destroyed by the hundreds every week, craftsmanship was a death sentence. To truly understand the gap between these two nations, you have to look at a staggering disparity in how they approached the factory floor. You see, a Tiger I tank was never really a model in the way we think of an American M4 Sherman. Every Tiger was practically a unique individual. Because parts were hand-fitted to such tight tolerances, a fuel pump from a Tiger produced in October might not fit perfectly into a Tiger produced in December without significant filing and adjustment by a master mechanic. This meant that in the heat of the Russian summer or the grit of the Tunisian desert, interchangeable parts was a concept that simply didn't exist for the Panzerwaffe. Now, consider the setup for a global war. You need volume. You need a tide of steel that never stops rising. But the Germans created a payoff that was the exact opposite. They used over 2,400 separate interlocking parts just for the Tiger's hull. The armor plates weren't just welded together, they were joined using complex dovetail joints, labor-intensive notches cut into the thick steel to ensure maximum structural integrity before the welding even began. It made the tank incredibly tough, yes, but it also made it an industrial nightmare to build. Therefore, while the American arsenal of democracy was screaming toward a peak of 2,000 Shermans a month, the Henschel factory was struggling to put out 25 Tigers. Think about that math for a moment. It isn't just a slight edge, it's a different universe of capability. We often look back and marvel at the Tiger's 88mm gun, but the real weapon of the war was the assembly line. By the time the war ended, Germany had produced only about 1,350 Tiger I tanks total across the entire war. To put that in perspective, the U.S. produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. But the precision paradox went deeper than the factory floor. It extended to the very components that made the Tiger a legend. Take, for instance, the HL-230 Maybach engine. It was a 23-liter V12 masterpiece, but it was built like a racing engine. It required high-octane fuel that Germany was constantly running out of, and it was so finely tuned that a single piece of grit in the air intake could lead to a catastrophic engine fire. If you've ever spent time under the hood of a machine you rely on, you'll appreciate the brutal maintenance ratio that plagued the German crews. For every single hour a Tiger spent in actual combat, it demanded up to 10 hours of back-breaking, intensive maintenance. This is where that world-class craftsmanship actually killed the mission. Contrast that with the U.S. Army. If a Sherman's transmission blew, a repair team could often swap the entire unit in a single day, simply because the bolts were in the exact same place on every single tank. But if a Tiger's transmission failed, which it did frequently because it was moving 60 tons with a gearbox designed for 40, the repair was a nightmare. The most infamous example of this over-engineering trap was the interleaved road wheels we discussed earlier. To change a single inner wheel that had been damaged by a mine or a mechanical failure, a crew had to remove up to 9 other wheels first. It was a clockwork design that functioned beautifully in a clean testing facility, but turned a simple repair into a multi-day ordeal under enemy fire. This leads us to a fundamental truth that many of us who have spent a lifetime in industry understand. Complexity is the enemy of reliability. The Germans were so obsessed with the micro, the perfect weld, the smoothest gear transition, the tightest seal, that they completely lost sight of the macro. They were building the finest tanks in the world for a war that required the most tanks in the world. But there was a darker side to this precision. Because the designs were so complex, they were constantly being improved mid-production. Instead of freezing a design and mass-producing it for 2 years, the Germans introduced thousands of minor changes to the Tiger throughout its production run. One batch might have a different commander's cupola. The next might have a modified exhaust system. While this meant the Tiger was always evolving, it also meant that the supply chain for spare parts was a fragmented, chaotic mess. Imagine being a supply officer in 1944 trying to find a specific gasket for a Tiger that was built in June of '43, only to realize that the factory changed that gasket design in July. Therefore, thousands of Tigers were abandoned by their crews not because they were knocked out by enemy fire, but because a $5 part failed and the replacement was nowhere to be found. As we look at the rusting hulls of these machines in museums today, we should see them for what they truly were. A monument to the quality over quantity delusion. The Germans had the best engineers, but the Allies had the best systems. And as any veteran of the shop floor will tell you, a good system will beat a great engineer every single day. But the nightmare wasn't just in the making of the tank, it was in the moving of it. Because once you've handcrafted a 60-ton beast that breaks if you look at it wrong, you have to figure out how to get it to the fight without it falling apart on the way. In the theater of war, we often focus on the thunder of the guns and the clash of the steel. We talk about the greatest generation in terms of their bravery at the front, but any man who has ever managed a fleet of trucks or run a complex job site knows that the real battle is won in the back office and the motor pool. You can have the most powerful tool in the world, but if you can't get it to the job site, or if it consumes more resources than the job is worth, it's not an asset, it's a liability. History suggests the Tiger was the ultimate liability. It was a behemoth that demanded a king's ransom in fuel, transport, and time, leading to a brutal reality for the German army. Whenever they managed a tactical breakout, it almost inevitably led to a mechanical breakdown. For those of us who appreciate the sturdy reliability of an old Ford or a well-maintained tractor, the logistics of the Tiger sound like a nightmare from which there is no escape. The setup for any armored operation is the ability to move fast and strike where the enemy is weak. But the Tiger was a prisoner of its own weight. It was so heavy that it dictated where the war could be fought. You couldn't just drive a Tiger across a field and expect to arrive on the other side. You had to scout every bridge, test every culvert, and pray the ground hadn't seen a drop of rain in a week. But the logistical nightmare began long before the tank ever reached the front lines, buried in a hidden obstacle we can call the railroad trap. You see, the Tiger was so wide it literally couldn't fit through standard European rail tunnels or across many bridges. To solve this, the Germans were forced to develop a specialized, narrow set of transport tracks just for travel. Imagine the scene. Before a Tiger could even be moved by train, the crew had to spend grueling hours jacking up that 60-ton beast, stripping off the outer layer of those complex road wheels and swapping out the wide combat tracks for the narrow ones. And once the train arrived at its destination, they had to do the entire exhausting process all over again in reverse. Therefore, a Tiger couldn't just show up at a crisis point on the front. It required a scheduled, multi-day engineering project just to get it off the rail car. But the logistical nightmare only worsened once the engine started. In an era where Germany was literally running out of oil, the Tiger was a glutton. The purple value statistics are staggering. On level roads, a Tiger 1 consumed roughly 2.5 gallons of high-grade petrol per mile. If it was maneuvering through the mud or snow of the Eastern Front, that consumption could double or triple. For a nation that was eventually using horse-drawn carts to move its supplies because of fuel shortages, dedicating a massive portion of the fuel supply to a handful of tanks was a strategic catastrophe. Now, let's talk about the breakout. In the classic blitzkrieg, the goal was to punch a hole in the enemy line and race into the rear. But for a Tiger unit, racing was impossible. If a Tiger commander pushed his tank too hard for too long, the heat buildup in the final drive units, the gears that transfer power to the tracks, would become so intense that the metal would literally soften and the gears would shred. There was another, more desperate crisis that haunted the Panzerwaffe every time they went into battle: the towing crisis. You have to realize that because the Tiger was so massive, there simply wasn't a standard German recovery vehicle capable of towing it. If a Tiger broke down or got stuck in the mire, it took 3 heavy FAMO half-tracks linked together in a precarious daisy chain just to pull a single Tiger out of the mud. In the heat of a chaotic retreat, those recovery teams often couldn't be assembled in time, leaving the world's most expensive tank abandoned and helpless. Therefore, the Germans were forced to blow up their own tanks with internal demolition charges to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. More Tigers were lost to their own cruise matches than to Allied shells. This created a psychological breakdown for the men in the field. Imagine being one of those 65-year-old veterans looking back at your time in the service, remembering the feeling of having a tool you couldn't trust. The Tiger crew lived in constant fear, not of the enemy, but of the terrain. They knew that if they went into a ditch, they were staying in that ditch. But the logistics of a behemoth extended even to the ammunition. The 88mm shells were massive and heavy. A Tiger carried 92 rounds, and reloading the tank was an exhausting multi-hour process that required the crew to manhandle heavy crates through small hatches. While a Sherman crew could be refueled and rearmed in a fraction of the time, the Tiger spent more time being pampered and prepped than it did actually fighting. Therefore, the Tiger became a tactical island. It could set on a hill and dominate everything within 2 miles, but it couldn't influence the battle 10 miles away. It was a fortress in a war of movement. In our lives, we know that the most expensive tool in the shed is the one that's too heavy to use for the daily chores. The Tiger was that tool. It was designed for a world that didn't exist, a world of infinite fuel, perfect bridges, and unlimited repair time. As the war progressed and the Allies began their massive bombing campaigns, the logistics shifted from difficult to impossible. The factories producing those 2,400 specialized parts were being turned into rubble. The bridges the Tigers needed were being dropped by P-47 Thunderbolts. The behemoth was being starved to death. But the ultimate conflict wasn't just about the Tiger's weight. It was about the fact that while Germany was struggling to move one Tiger to the front, the Allied autonomy was producing a system that made the Tiger's power irrelevant. The steel coffin was about to meet the industrial sledgehammer. In the history of industry, we often talk about quality control. We take pride in the craftsmanship of a tool that lasts a lifetime. But there is a different kind of quality, the quality of a system that simply refuses to break, even when it's under the most immense pressure imaginable. While the Germans were hand-polishing the gears of their Tigers, the Allies were doing something far more terrifying. They were treating war like a math problem. History suggests that the Tiger was a magnificent weapon, but it was fighting an opponent that had no reverse gear. The Allied economy was an industrial sledgehammer that turned the Tiger's superiority into a steel coffin. For those of us who remember the hum of American factories in the post-war years, we know what that kind of power feels like. It's the feeling of a machine that never stops. The setup for the German high command was the belief that their superior technology would create a quality gap the Allies could never cross. They figured if one Tiger could kill 5 Shermans, then they were winning. But the payoff they didn't account for was the sheer, relentless scale of the American and Soviet industrial engines. When you look at the cold, hard math of 1944, you see a relentless replacement rate that no amount of German engineering could overcome. In the staggering amount of time it took Germany to repair just one damaged Tiger, the United States had already built 3 brand new Shermans and shipped them halfway across the Atlantic. This is the exact moment where the Tiger's superiority vanished and it truly became a steel coffin. It didn't matter how many Allied tanks a Tiger crew knocked out because the Allied economy didn't care about individual losses. To the planners in Washington and Moscow, a tank was a consumable item, like a bullet or a ration tin. Now, consider the psychological toll on a German tanker. You've spent your morning expertly picking off a platoon of T-34s or Shermans. You feel invincible. But then you look over the next ridge and there are 20 more. You look at your fuel gauge and it's empty. You look at your ammunition rack and you're down to your last 3 shells. The Allied strategy wasn't to outfight the Tiger, it was to outlive it. If you want to see the moment the war was truly won, you have to look at the industrial statistics of 1944, which tell the story with brutal clarity. By that year, the sheer output of the city of Detroit alone was producing more military hardware than the entire nation of Germany. It wasn't just a factory town, it was a force of nature that the Tiger could never hope to stop. While German engineers were arguing over the metallurgical composition of the Tiger's drive sprocket, American factories were using interchangeable precision. We weren't building masterpieces, we were building a standard. When a Sherman broke a track, the crew didn't need a master craftsman to forge a new link. They just grabbed one off the nearest supply truck. This logistical velocity meant that the Allied reverse gear didn't exist. Even when we lost a battle, our strength grew. When the Germans won a battle, they grew weaker because they couldn't replace the irreplaceable cost of the men and machines they lost. But the steel coffin wasn't just about production numbers. It was about the evolution of the countermeasure. Because the Allies had such a massive industrial base, they could afford to experiment. They developed the Firefly in Britain, a Sherman with a 17-pounder gun specifically designed to crack a tiger's skull. They developed the M36 Jackson and the M26 Pershing. They didn't need to build a perfect tank, they just needed to build a good enough tank with a big enough gun to end the tiger's reign. The most decisive factor, a reality that is often forgotten in the shadow of the tank's legend, was the overwhelming air umbrella that covered the European battlefield. By 1944, the Allied industrial engine had flooded the skies with so many P-47s and Hawker Typhoons that a Tiger crew couldn't even risk starting their engine during daylight hours without being spotted. The Tiger had been designed to be the undisputed king of the ground, but the hard truth was that the Allied economy had already seized the sky. Therefore, the Tiger's heavy armor became its own prison. The crews spent their days hiding under haystacks and camouflage netting, terrified of the Jabos, the Allied fighter bombers. Imagine the frustration of a Tiger commander, a man who knows he has the most powerful machine on the planet, but he is forced to move only at night, crawling through the mud, constantly checking the sky. His invincible tank has become a 60-ton target. But here is the final but. The Allied economy didn't just produce tanks, it produced sustainment. For every Sherman tank on the front, there was a massive tail of fuel trucks, repair shops, and mobile kitchens. The Tiger, by contrast, was a head without a body. It had the teeth, but it had no stomach. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were so desperate for fuel that their Tiger trap was fully sprung. They had the tanks, but they had to abandon them because they ran out of gas. History shows us that in a total war, the factory is the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. The Tiger was a brilliant engineering achievement, but it was built for a duel, and the Allies brought a riot. They turned the Tiger's craftsmanship into a luxury the Germans couldn't afford, and its weight into a burden they couldn't carry. As we move toward the end of the Tiger's story, we have to look at the nostalgia gap. We have to ask why we still look at this broken, failed machine with such awe, while the working man's tanks that actually won the war are often relegated to the background. It is a curious thing, the way time filters our memories. Many of us who have spent a lifetime around machinery know that the most temperamental, expensive, and difficult tools are often the ones we talk about at the end of the day. We don't sit around the campfire telling stories about the reliable old lawnmower that started every time for 20 years. We talk about the classic car that broke our heart and emptied our wallet but looked magnificent in the driveway. History suggests that the Tiger tank has become the classic car of the Second World War. We have built a heavy metal myth around it, romanticizing a weapon that was, by almost every strategic measure, a failure. To understand why this tank still holds such a grip on our imagination, we have to examine the kill ratio legend, the very bedrock of the Tiger myth. Most of us have heard the staggering stories, like Michael Whitman at Villiers-Bocage, where a single Tiger was credited with dismantling an entire British armored column in a matter of minutes. The statistics often cited are enough to stop anyone in their tracks. Tiger units allegedly claimed a 10-to-1 kill ratio over Allied armor. When you hear a figure like that, it's easy to get swept up in the legend, to see the Tiger as a lone, heroic knight on a battlefield of peasants, while overlooking the cold logistics that were failing it behind the scenes. But as any man who has ever looked at a balance sheet knows, revenue is not profit. A high kill ratio is meaningless if the cost of acquisition is too high. The purple value fact that the myth ignores is that for every Allied tank a Tiger killed, the Allies produced 10 more. Therefore, the Tiger's tactical success was a drop of water in an ocean. It was winning the battle, but losing the ledger. So why do we keep coming back to it? Why are there thousands of model kits, video games, and books dedicated to this one tank, while the humble M4 Sherman or the T-34 are often treated as cannon fodder? The answer lies in the aesthetic of power. The Tiger looks exactly like what a tank should look like. It is unapologetically aggressive, square-jawed, and massive. It represents a time when engineering was visible. You could see the rivets, the thick plates, and the massive muzzle brake. For those of us who grew up in an era before plastic and microchips, there's a deep nostalgic pull toward that kind of raw mechanical honesty. We romanticize the Tiger because it represents a peak of craftsmanship that we feel is missing from the modern world. However, there is a but that we must face. This romanticization is a trap. When we focus on the heavy metal, we ignore the human cost. The myth tells us the Tiger was a masterpiece. The reality tells us it was a steel coffin for the boys who had to wait for spare parts that never came. By focusing on the machine, we distance ourselves from the messy logistical reality of war. We turn a catastrophic engineering error into a legend of lost superiority. If we look beneath the surface of the history books, we find that the Tiger's most enduring legacy was its role as the ultimate propaganda tool, not just for the German High Command in 1943, but for historians even today. It offers us a simple, almost comforting narrative, the idea that Germany had the better technology, but the Allies simply had more stuff. It's a story that suggests excellence can always be found on the losing side. But as any man who has ever had to keep a job site running knows, true excellence in engineering isn't about building the biggest gun in a vacuum. It's about building the machine that actually works when the temperature hits 40 below and the supply lines have been cut to pieces. Therefore, the heavy metal myth is actually a testament to our own biases. We prefer the spectacular failure to the boring success. We find the Tiger more interesting than the Sherman for the same reason we find the outlaw more interesting than the accountant. The Sherman won the war with math, logistics, and standardization, the very things that make a modern economy thrive. The Tiger tried to win the war with magic and masterpieces. As we look at the final section of this story, we have to move past the myth and look at what remains. What did the Tiger actually leave behind besides a few rusting hulks in European museums and 1,000 hours of documentary footage? The answer is a lesson in the dangers of the trap, the belief that complexity can ever replace common sense. Every story has an ending, but for some machines, the end of the war was only the beginning of their influence. When we look back at the rubble of 1945, it's easy to think of the Tiger as a dead end, a prehistoric monster that died out because it couldn't adapt. But for those of us who have spent our lives watching technology evolve, we know that nothing truly disappears, it just changes shape. The legacy of the Iron Beast isn't found in a victory parade, but in the DNA of every main battle tank that followed it. History suggests that while the Tiger lost the war, the 88 and the heavy tank philosophy it championed set the stage for the next 40 years of the Cold War. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of Berlin, a new and terrifying realization began to take hold among the Allied commanders, a moment we can look back on as the birth of the Cold War arms race. Even in victory, American and Soviet generals were examining captured Tigers with a lingering sense of what if? They had won through the industrial sledgehammer of mass production, but they knew with absolute certainty that they never wanted their boys to be on the receiving end of a weapon like that 88 gun ever again. This realization sparked a global race to prioritize exactly what the Tiger excelled at: long-range, high-velocity lethality. What followed in the immediate wake of the war was a period of intense technological scavenging that would redefine armored warfare for decades to come. The Allies didn't simply scrap the Tigers they found among the ruins. Instead, they dissected them like biologists studying an apex predator that had finally been brought down. The British, the Americans, and especially the Soviets rushed the Tiger's superior optics, its precise gun ballistics, and its advanced suspension systems back to their own top-secret labs. Almost overnight, the 88 became the global gold standard. Every tank designer, from the factories in Detroit to the design bureaus in the Urals, spent the late 1940s obsessed with a single, daunting question. How do we build a machine that hits as hard as a Tiger but moves with the relentless speed of a T-34? Therefore, the Tiger was the father of the main battle tank, or TMBT. Before the Tiger, tanks were divided into light, medium, and heavy. After the Tiger, the world realized that a medium tank with a heavy gun was the future. You can see the echoes of the Tiger in the British Centurion, the American M60, and the Soviet T-54. They all chased that purple value of the Tiger, the ability to dominate the battlefield from a distance, but they finally applied the lesson the Germans missed. They built them to be mass-produced. But the legacy isn't just in the steel, it's in the 88 itself. For many veterans of the 65-plus generation, the 88 remains the most famous artillery piece in history. Its purple value was its versatility. It started as an anti-aircraft gun, became an anti-tank gun, and ended as a legend. Even today, when we talk about high-velocity tank rounds, we are still speaking the language of the 88. It taught the world that a tank is only as good as the reach of its punch. There is, however, a more somber but to this legacy. The Tiger's true iron echo is a warning about the dangers of technocracy. It stands as a 60-ton monument to what happens when a nation's leaders become so enamored with superweapons that they forget the human and logistical foundations of reality. It's a lesson that resonates today in our world of billion-dollar jets and complex software. The Tiger reminds us that a tool that is too complicated to fix is a tool that eventually belongs to your enemy. As we look at the few remaining Tigers, like Tiger 131 at the Bovington Tank Museum, we see more than just a weapon. We see the final physical remains of a philosophy that valued the masterpiece over the mission. We hear the echoes of the men who served in them, men who were given the best gun in the world, but were betrayed by a transmission that couldn't handle the weight of their own ambition. The Tiger trap was finally closed when the last shell was fired, but the questions it raised remain. How do we balance quality with quantity? How do we ensure our technology serves us rather than enslaving us to a supply chain? In the end, the Tiger didn't change the outcome of the war, but it changed the way we think about power. It proved that you can have the thickest skin and the sharpest teeth in the forest, but if you can't get to the fight, you're just a ghost in the making. And as the final echoes of the 88 fade into history, we are left with the memory of a beast that was too powerful to live and too legendary to ever truly stay dead. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the mechanical reality of the Tiger, then you're exactly the kind of viewer we built this channel for. Someone who values the facts over the folklore. History is a conversation that never truly ends, and I'd value your perspective in that dialogue. If you found a specific insight today that changed how you view the heavy metal myth, please leave a comment and let us know. Your experiences and insights often provide the best context for these stories. If you believe this kind of measured, logistical look at history is something more people should see, hitting the like button and sharing this video with a friend or a fellow veteran is the best way to help us grow. Finally, to ensure you're with us for our next deep dive into the untold stories of the greatest generation, make sure to subscribe and join our community. It's an honor to have you at the table. Thank you for watching.